Well, welcome to Intersection, where theology and practice meet. It's lovely to see names popping in to the attendees today, and let us know where you're coming from. I see folks coming in from one side of the coast to the other. That's wonderful. I'm here with my host, Randy Harris. My name's Carson Reed, and welcome again to Intersection number 4. Our topic today is congregational response to COVID-19. We'll be taking a look at some data and some research from our special guest in just a moment. We always enjoy engaging in substantial, timely topics, and today will not be an exception to that. We want you to be a part of the conversation, so as we go through the hour, when you have a question, take a moment to type something into the chat. You can direct that to the panelists, or to the panelists and to the full attendees, either way. But we'll be watching for that. In the second half of the program, we'll be taking a look at your questions. Before I turn to Randy and we set the table for this, I want to invite us together for a time of prayer. God is present with us in this digital space. And so let's take a minute here and engage in prayer for God's blessing and insight as we share this hour together. Let us pray. Eternal presence, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, hear our prayers and be merciful to us as we engage in this conversation. Amen. Well, Randy, it seems like the world has changed since March. Set the table for us. How would you describe the context of congregational life as we inch ever slowly through this summer?
Well, the conversation we were having in March before spring break is, are we going to come back to school after spring break? And now the question is, are we going to come back to school, this year? And I think, I was looking through our list of attendees, and Patrick's there in New York, and they're at one place where they've kind of been through the worst of it, and you got several from large cities in Texas, which are still very much in the midst of it, and some from the West Coast where things are even worse than they are in Texas. And I think now we know, if we thought this was going to be a sprint and that our job was just sort of kind of keep the boat afloat until we all came back together again, that's not the place we're going to be. We're not going to return to normal this year, even if we start having services together. And so now the question is not just, okay, how do we keep the boat afloat, but how do we flourish in what, if it's not going to be a marathon, it's at least a middle distance race. So this is no sprint, and any illusions we've had about that, are kind of gone now.
Yeah. And all the more reason for us to pay close attention to things, and why we have Dr. Suzie Macaluso with us today, who's a sociologist. Suzie is a researcher into religion and American religious practices and life. She's also the director of the Pruitt Gerontology Center here at ACU. And Suzie, you also do research and work with us in the Siburt Institute, so it's great to have you on Intersection today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about the conversation today.
Well, so are we. One of the things we could just start with is Randy and I hang out over in the College of Biblical Studies. We are theologians and ministers. We think about pastoral life and congregational life. Why in the world would we be drawing a sociologist into this conversation? that might bear us just taking a moment to talk about. What does sociology bring to the table for communities of like congregations and churches, and what's the possibilities, and maybe what are some of the limits that sociology or research might bring to conversations that happen among churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the interesting things that sociology can provide is kind of this outside look in. So because sociology is not focused on theology and right or wrong, but more so on how people experience church and how people experience religion, we can provide a little bit different lens for understanding what's going on in churches. So we're interested in, no matter what religion someone is in, we are interested in how they experience it, because for them, it's meaningful in their lives, right? So regardless of any other thoughts on God and the nature of humans, it's important because it matters to them, right? So because religion matters to me, it's worthy of study. And so as a researcher, one of the things that we can do through our study of religion is to assess, what is it that people think? What is it that people believe? If you're trying to reach people where they are, first you have to know where they are. Right?
Maybe.
So you
Yeah.
can have a firm theology and guidance from God on where you're going and where you're directing your congregation. But if you don't know where they're at in the starting place, you may just overshoot or miss the mark completely, go over their heads, or be talking down to them. And so it's really important to kind of gauge where people are at, I think.
Thanks. Randy, how does that sound to you? How does that help us as theologians?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One is almost, again, we'll see this in the chat. Y'all feel free to chime in. Almost everybody's had the experience in church where one person will talk to one elder about one thing that bothers them, and all of a sudden it's everybody says, where an anecdote becomes a data point. And, one of the things sociologists do is actually count things. And sometimes our little world of experience is so small, we don't actually know what people think. So it seems to me there'd be two ways it could go wrong. Suzie, you can respond to this. One is you could just ignore the data, which is to ignore reality. It's to ignore the truth of how people actually are thinking and feeling about things. The other is you could make all your decisions based on sociological studies, which would also be a problem, because sometimes it doesn't matter what people think, the call of God or the gospel takes you in a certain direction. So you can respond to that however you want to. It seems like data is our friend. It seems to me, I'd rather know things than not know things. I'd rather know things than be guessing about things, and then make decisions. What do you think?
I think that's really a good way of putting it, that we kind of have those two ends, and what we strive for is somewhere in the middle, right? Where you have information gathered through data that you are using to help kind of craft the ministry. But you can't just go with data. You at some points, you just have to use kind of scripture and the guidance of being a pastor. And sometimes it doesn't matter if everyone thinks you're wrong. If that's if that's God's will, then that's God's will. And so, yeah, I think it's somewhere in the middle, that you can't be only reliant on data, and you can't also say data doesn't matter, because the voices of the people do matter. Because if you don't listen to the voices of the people, you won't have a flock to shepherd.
Thanks, Suzie, for that. And that's one of the reasons why we want you to share with us today is let's take a look at data and let's talk about how data might help us reflect on our own particular congregational contexts as we practice faithfully the work of congregational leadership. But you did a survey back a couple, 3 months, I guess in May, and tell us a little bit about the research project itself. Set the table for us here real quick.
Yeah, so in early May, it just occurred to me that we had this opportunity to collect data to kind of gauge people's feelings about church. And so I had some money left over in my budget because I didn't get to travel in the spring. So I did a survey of over 1,900 people. This is a national survey, including all 50 United States. And all denominations and all religious backgrounds, although obviously majority Christian, both Protestant and Catholic. And of those 1,900 participants, there were 1,449 who attended church at least sometimes. And so that's the group that I'll be talking about. That's the group that's kind of interest to us, is the people who attend. The people who didn't attend at all, they didn't get the rest of the questions. Right. And so we have an average age of about 45 years old, ranging from age 18 to age 90. So a pretty good representative age range. Again, all 50 states are represented. We have just about a little over half are women, which you would expect. And it's a pretty well-educated group with about half of the respondents having a college degree or higher. And it was done online, so you usually have a little bit higher educated when you do an online survey.
Interesting. Well, part of the thing you were looking at was with regard to church attendance. And among those churchgoers, I think 1,400, so on and so forth, what were you seeing in terms of what people were experiencing with regard to worship in May?
Yeah, so in terms of church attendance, we had, prior to the start of the pandemic, about 18% said that they seldom attended church and 17% attended a few times a year. So you have this group of about 35%, about a third of the group that doesn't attend very often, as compared to the rest who attend at least a couple of times a month, with half of those saying they attended weekly or more than once a week. So we got some good variety there that allowed us to make some comparisons between those who attend regularly and those who don't attend as regularly. And the average church that these people attended was between 100 and 250 people. So that's pretty standard. And Catholics represented about 23% of the sample, which again, makes sense. And then a large group from Churches of Christ, because I reached out to my circles, so oversampled Churches of Christ. And most of these people had been attending their church for a while. About 10% though had been attending less than a year. But the big things that we were looking at was really how they feel about kind of 10 key factors in terms of their anxiety, how their church was handling things through the pandemic, and wanting to understand where they were at this particular point in time.
Mm-hmm. I do want us to talk about anxiety and some of the things you've mentioned, but you also sampled in terms of the kinds of experiences they were having, what kinds of worship experiences they were having. Are they live Zooming or live streaming or Zooming or not meeting at all? Or what were you finding in May there with regard to worship practices?
Yeah, so about 3/4 of the participants said that their church was utilizing live streaming, whether that be through Facebook, YouTube, or some other channel, maybe through their website. So a good portion of these churches were doing some sort of live streaming. And then 37% were using Zoom meetings or worship services. And then 21% were holding some sort of virtual small group or Bible study that was done publicly. And then again, another 20% were having virtual kind of small group meetings. And then there were things like phone trees and Facebook groups for members, private Facebook pages, Other social media was used by a number of churches. Online courses and workshops were being offered. But then there are this interesting group of about 9% of people who said that their church did none of these things. And a good chunk of that 9% is Catholic. About half of them are Catholic. And so my intuition would be that because Catholic services tend to be very similar across churches, that people are tuning into a different church. So my mother-in-law, for example, is Catholic, and she just tunes into a church that some of her friends go to, not the one that she usually attends, that she's in their parish boundaries. And so my guess is that the Catholic Church, and a lot of them have kind of brought their resources together because they're more organized than, say, denominations like Churches of Christ.
Sure. It's interesting thinking about that. We've got an opportunity to do a poll with our attendees about their current worship practices. I know this is not really scientific, but it might be just kind of fun to do. So those of you who are attending today, and all of our participants, I think you'll be able to see in just a moment a poll question pop up on your screen, and love for you to take a moment to answer this. What sort of church service is your church hosting? And if you'll give a quick response to that, it'd be interesting to see where we're at now, or with this population now, and in terms of your practice. So take a moment to do that. I just did it myself, and Renee will bring us up some totals here in a second. Now, again, in May, about 75% were live streaming, and about what percentage were Zooming at that time, or Zoom only, I guess?
Well, so 37% were Zooming, but there's an overlap. So some churches were using Zoom and live stream in some way, whether that be maybe Zoom Bible classes, but live stream services. And so there were about 190 churches that were just using Zoom. So it was a little bit less, about 20%. Were just using Zoom as opposed to Zoom plus live stream.
Right. Good. Renee, I don't know if we're at a place where you can post results of that quick poll. Hey, here it comes. I'm seeing this as saying that about 30% of our attendees have a live stream only experience. Wow, no one is having face-to-face only in this group. Face-to-face with live stream available. A strong showing there at 44%, so face-to-face with live stream, right? And then about a quarter are using Zoom or a similar pattern or a similar platform. Now, I think we've set that up 74. I believe that's an exclusive. You had to only choose one thing. And I know one of our participants says, well, we're doing multiple versions of this, so this is a limited sort of thing. But can you make something of that, Suzie, in light of where things were with your more scientifically driven analysis back in May?
I think this matches pretty well with what we see in May. I would imagine that in May, a lot of those people who said they were face-to-face with the online option, probably fewer of those were meeting face-to-face, although we did have some states that never stopped meeting. And so that's one of the limitations here, is I didn't think of that as an option, that there would have been churches that met the whole time. So some of that none that weren't doing any of these things, it's possible that those were small congregations that never had to stop meeting.
Right.
Because they were small, because those that said none, they were more likely to be a little bit on the smaller side. So
yes.
Depending on what your state's limitations were, you could have kept meeting the whole time.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of curious. I could see in terms of age, the age in your survey work, Suzie, are older people more reluctant to come back to church, or are they kind of ambivalent? What about the age distribution in response to attendance?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is I expected there to be some really big differences based on age of respondent, but there really aren't that many differences by age. We do see that older respondents attend more often than younger respondents. I think we would expect that. Older respondents are slightly more likely to be highly involved in their congregation. But older respondents are less likely to strongly agree that the pandemic has been difficult for them. And that's possibly because if they're retired already, they're not having the same stress of their job being moved or being laid off. So they are handling the pandemic better than young people. Mm-hmm. Older respondents are also more likely to feel that their congregation is doing a good job. However they're responding to the pandemic, but there's not really any difference by age in anxiety about coming back together.
Interesting.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah. But there is anxiety present, right?
There is.
Right, and this may get you in. I think you did a little bit of quantitative. What are people concerned about, or what you wish church leaders would know. What were some of the things that you see coming out of your survey work that would speak to the kinds of concerns that people are having, or at least were having in May?
Yeah, so I asked 2 questions that were the quantitative questions about anxiety. The first is, I feel anxious about attending small groups when we get the all clear signal from civic authorities. So this was, how strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement? And more than half, 52% of respondents agree or strongly agree that they are anxious about gathering in small groups, even once they have the all clear. And then when the second question was the same question, only about attending larger worship services once we get the all clear, and how anxious they are. And in this, more people were anxious. So 60% said they agreed or strongly agreed, with very few people saying they strongly disagreed. That made up only about 1/5. So 20% said they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. Mm-hmm. So overall, more than half of respondents said that they were anxious about coming back together in any form for in-person groups.
Well, that anxiety is sort of, I've been curious a little bit about churches that are beginning to engage in face-to-face participation, how many people are in fact coming back. And I've got another poll question, but I don't know that it's going to help, because I think a while ago, I don't know that we've got anyone who's actually hosting some sort of a face-to-face service at this present time.
Well, we do have 44% who are doing both. So
we're doing both. Okay,
so that 44% could tell us
something
what they're experiencing on who's coming.
Well, let's go to the polls again here, folks. Those of you participating, let's put up the second question here about current involvement letter. If you're hosting a face-to-face service, you may also be doing live stream or other things. What percentage of the congregation, using a pre-pandemic framework here, is present in your face-to-face service? I'd be kind of curious to see what you think that might look like. So give that a quick response, and we'll tally that up in a little bit. So again, Suzie, you were saying that a lot of folks are there's a level of anxiety about when to come back, or will we, or when to come back.
Yeah. I also want to state that there is an overwhelming sense of we want to come back. So another question was, I'm looking forward to a time when we can gather together, and an overwhelming majority were looking forward to that time, but at the same time, they were anxious about it. So that anxiety doesn't mean I don't want to come back together. It means I want to be there so much, but I'm worried about what that will look like.
Yeah.
So are your one of the worryments that ministers have expressed is, once people get used to having sort of worship on demand, that is, I can watch it whenever I want to, that they'll wonder why they went to the trouble of coming before. But I'm guessing your intuitions are that's an overblown worry that people want to come back.
Yeah, people want the community. I think you'll actually see people who weren't participating in the live streams or weren't watching or participating in Zooms who are back in the buildings once they deem it safe for their family, because of that sense of what they're really wanting is community. That's harder to get over live stream, a little easier over Zoom, but still not the same.
Yeah. Hey, Renee, why don't you, if you've got some, hey, here we go. What do we got? We've got, if you're hosting, so if you're doing face-to-face, we're seeing of those who are able to respond to this, 29% said it's not applicable, but quite a bit are seeing a fairly low number, right? Is that how you're reading that, Suzie?
Yeah, it shows me that in the best case scenario, 50% or fewer are coming. Yeah. And that makes sense because of high risk populations that wouldn't want to attend. And also because of concerns that lower risk populations have about infecting higher risk populations. That's also an important component here.
Yeah. I think what that does is raise for ministers the huge problem of it's one thing to minister to a virtual congregation, it's another thing to minister to an live congregation, but the hardest possible world is trying to do both at the same time. So you don't want these people left behind who are out there, but you do have some people who are in front of you, and we don't have any great models, I don't think, for how to do both at once. And again, I'm curious on the chat if people want to chime in. Yes, no, yeah, it's a problem, especially those of you who are preaching to both live and the virtual audiences. And that's a really interesting experience, but just how you try to attend to both at the same time. It's not just a preaching problem, it's a pastoral problem.
Exactly. And maybe I took a flyer here and created a third poll question that Randy, I don't think we got a chance to even fully line this out, but maybe we could go with this third poll question. Framing that is the challenge right now in many ways is how do we continue to foster spiritual vitality and liveliness in our congregation? So Renee, pop this up. Let's just this is a yes, no, but if you answer yes to this, I want you to put something in the chat. Help us know. During the pandemic, has your church launched new practices to foster spiritual life, new programs, new activities? Put a yes or no there. And then if you've got a yes, then pop over to the chat and let us know what some of those things are as you try to navigate this both and kind of world that Randy's speaking about. As we're kind of letting that play itself out, you spoke a little bit about what folks want church leaders to know, Suzie. I don't know if there's something else there, but where I'm kind of headed with this, it would be to take a moment for you to talk about what do you think ministers could take away from what you're learning out of this material? What might ministers need to do or to know or to recognize in light of some of the research you've been doing here?
Yeah, in another survey, actually a set of surveys for individual churches of Christ that I did, there were some open-ended questions that asked, the first one asked for parents of children, what are some concerns that you have? And the number one thing was, how do children social distance? And I'm concerned, and this was the sentiment of these 75 participants, I'm concerned that my children will bring the virus in and infect older members or members who are in higher risk categories. And that was a common thread, was this concern for the other. And I think that's really important that we not discount that people aren't just worried about themselves and in this idea of coming back, but they're worried about what it'll mean for other people. And also what it will mean to have some people at the church building and other people feeling left out.
Right.
And then in the more general question on that survey, just an open-ended, what are some things you want your leadership to know? There's a lot of concern, again, for those most vulnerable members and ensuring their health and safety. This idea, we want to be back together, but we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that protects people. There was a lot of people saying we need to be in constant prayer about the state of things, lots of suggestions for socially distancing during services. Also a desire to continue online even after, because some people have been able to connect that weren't able to connect previously. Whether they worked on Sundays or they were sick or they were caring for someone, that was helpful for them. And a lot of concerns just over social distancing and what this is going to be. So I think that for ministers, my word of wisdom would be to take things slow and to think about ways that we can, like Randy said, flourish during this time. What are some practices that can be implemented to help bring people together? Some of the concerns were that some of the leaders in some of these congregations were not reaching out to their members in a personal way, that they were relying on social media and email to do that work for them. We've got to kind of go back to old school front porch conversations, telephone calls and things like that, to try to connect and continue to build community outside of the church building.
That's really nice. I was just thinking, I had a conversation with a minister recently, and he said that he and other ministry staff and their elders are now doing drive-by pastoral visits, calling ahead and having front porch conversations, and people are loving it. And being able to social distance outdoor, but to actually see somebody face to face, even if you can't give a hug, is really making a difference. Hey, Renee, or Randy, you got a thought there? And then
let's see what we got on this first.
Yeah. So over half, am I reading this right? 60% are saying, yeah, we are doing some new things. And I've been kind of keeping an eye on the chat there. A lot of good ideas, a lot of good practices. I see that people
pretty creative stuff that folks are doing.
Yeah, I like that. I like it a lot.
Well, a couple of questions that have sort of popped up that maybe Carson's going to ask, but I'll probably ask in a different way.
Go ahead.
People are getting hit with a lot of so-called data. Okay, how do you sort it out? How do you get data you can trust? And most of us aren't very good at creating questions. I mean, the way we do surveys, they become almost promissory notes, and then people have expectations that all you were trying to do is get information. But now, if you do a survey, you got to be ready to respond to it in some way. And people have disagreements about the facts. So how do you become a good Christian consumer of facts and data?
That is a great question. I think you start off with using surveys in particular. Let's focus on surveys. Using surveys when they're necessary and not too often. But also there tends to be a kind of a tendency to put every question on a survey, everything you might think would be interesting. And that creates survey fatigue, because there becomes these questions of, why am I answering this? What are they going to do with this information? And that's not super helpful. So you want to kind of scale back and create kind of timely little gauges. You're basically taking the temperature of the congregation at any particular point in time, making it very clear why you're going to do this, and then making sure that you follow up with that information of, okay, here's what we hear from you. Here's what we're going to do as a result. There was one church that I did a survey for who then shared with me what their pastoral response was. And it was a well-written letter about, okay, we hear what you're saying about anxiety. Here's our plan going forward, and we will reassess at this time. And I thought that was a great use of data. In a more general sense, in terms of data, I think the best thing that pastors can do is stop spouting data from the pulpit unless they are 100% sure of the context of that data. And stop saying, sociologists agree that. Sociologists rarely agree about anything.
That's lovely.
So I think that's important too.
Well, there's a question here that's come in that sort of tags on this. And folks, by the way, if you've got a question, this is a good time to pop them into chat. We'll kind of turn toward your questions here for the balance of our time with Suzie. But Suzie, thinking about that, one participant says, it's great when you're talking about the reasonable majority, but there's always those folks out on the far ends of the bell curve who've got extreme positions. How do we minister or attend to those people out at the extremes at this time? We minister to one extreme, then the other side's just going to get even more outraged. How do we manage that? And Randy, that may be one you want to take a shot at as well. Any thoughts there, Suzie?
I mean, the only thought that comes to mind is communication and letting those people who are on the edges know that they are heard and that their position is valued, but that we're going to do things this way because of whatever. Mm-hmm. I think that when people express those views, their biggest complaint is usually that they're not being heard or that their point of view is being overlooked. And so I think it's really important for leadership to acknowledge, I hear you, your position is valid, however, and then stating, having a good reason for why you're going to do what you're going to do.
Yeah. I've had the experience of sometimes engaging in survey work in congregations, not because the leadership didn't know where the bell curve was at, but to be able to establish a clear response to the fringes. Mm-hmm. But we've listened to the church, and 80% of you actually think X, not Y and Z out on the edges. And so I've had the experience of letting surveys actually help manage the extremes in all of that.
I think some of the anxiety is it just seems to be such a moving target. And I think that's just psychologically hard. And, I'm almost to the point where I think leaders ought to paint the worst case scenario and then work back from that. That we're not going to be getting together anytime in the foreseeable future. And if conditions change where we can all come together in 2 weeks, we'll and maybe we need to be clearer about what that is. But it's a little bit of a moving target. And I think there's a percentage of people out there that I'd just like to know what we're going to do. Well, we'll tell you what we're doing this week, but I don't know. Maybe we need to be canceling things a little further out and say, if things change and we can put them back on the calendar, we will. But I don't know. What do you think about that? Because I think people are struggling with the
ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is that one of the key one of the key principles of leadership is being able to address what reality is, and to be able to name reality. And what you're proposing, Randy, certainly speaks to that. Suzie, there's a little question here that comes in, but I can see others would want to know. One person asked, is there a sort of a template that a person could use to put together a little congregational survey to get a pulse on the church? What would you say to a minister or somebody on a church staff who's like, well, we want to do a little survey? How would we do that to get some sense of what the church is thinking about X or Y or something?
Yeah, so I can't think of any great templates. I know that, of course, we have some things we've done through the Siburt Institute. If you want a bigger picture of church health, and then I will be doing a series of blog posts for Mosaic that will include the specific questions that I asked on this most recent survey, that anyone can take those questions and put them into Google Forms or even into a SurveyMonkey survey or Qualtrics or any of the others to do a quick poll. There's lots of online options that are free and pretty easy to use. The key to survey research is making sure that you're asking just one question at a time, that your statements aren't double-barreled, meaning that you're not really asking two things and they could agree with one and disagree with the other. That creates confusion. Worst case scenario, if you're really not sure how to ask a question, you can ask for feedback, a simple open-ended, tell me what your concerns are. And then you look through and see, okay, what are the majority of concerns that have come through? Mm-hmm. You can always, of course, reach out to, I'd say reach out to me, but I don't know that I need to be inundated with all of that, but reach out to the Siburt Institute for assistance or other groups like that. Or if you're in Nashville or Lubbock or Malibu or where there are sociologists who exist at the Church of Christ universities, they can be helpful in this as well. Thanks
for that, Suzie. Here's another question. What kind of data should church leaders be paying attention to as they discern about going back to church or having in-person gatherings? This probably moves us maybe beyond any one of our expertise with regard to medical, and none of us are public health officials here, but Suzie, you want to take a stab at that? What sort of data should we be looking at or paying attention to? Yeah, for us here at ACU, we are looking at data, thinking about the start of the fall semester and how that's going to go. And, looking at what are the case numbers like in your area, who is being affected, is there enough testing being done? Really though, I think like Randy said, you've got to be thinking about super long term. I don't think things can really be normal until we have a vaccine or a treatment that can really help those who are affected the most. Right. And so I think trying to look at those markers, it just becomes so difficult. Right. So yeah, I don't have a good answer other than just think long term. Yeah.
I think one thing that we'd want to do is read the data through our theology or our goals. So, one of the things I think churches would want to do in terms of our meetings and that is ask ourselves, okay, what does being a good neighbor mean in this situation? And that's a certain way to read the data. It's not just risk reward. It's okay, is this the thing that best serves the town, the world that we've been called to? So we're interpreting the data through a certain lens, love of God and neighbor. And it seems to me when we get in trouble is when we start trying to make a point, rather than sort of leading with, okay, where are we trying to get here? we don't have to save the church. The church is in good hands. The church has always been in good hands. That's not the point. Because sometimes we're looking at the same data, we're just not looking at it with the same, lens or framework. And so maybe we need to have some discussion about the lens that we're looking through.
That's good. Randy, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to play with another question here for a minute, but I'm queuing you up. Would you take a look through the chat? There was a lot of, as you noted earlier, creative ideas there and practices people are engaging in. I'd like for you to take a look and maybe you pick out one or two or three of those and reflect on them a little bit in light of how we practice spiritual vitality or help our congregation stay healthy. So I'll give you a couple of moments to do that, and I'm going to play with another question for a moment. This is back to the changing, fluxing reality of everything changes from day to day, moment to moment, Suzie. So I'll engage you with this a bit, back and forth here. Is it better to be consistent rather than be constantly changing plans as we announce things to our church? Things are always in flux, and so we announce something, then we have to pull it off the calendar. We put something else back on the calendar again. There's something about that question that I was kind of trying to look through my notes a moment ago. Seems like when we talked a couple of days ago, Suzie, you talked about how churches, there's something about communication, and I'm trying to remember how important communication is, or churches talking to their membership is. And I'd like to bring those two things together some way.
Yeah. So one of the questions that we did ask was about clarity of communication, and how strongly do you agree that, I can't think of the particular wording, but it was about communicating expectations and changes to the service. And like 80% of people said that they strongly agreed or agreed. I don't know where the other 20% were, but that the better we can communicate this, the more clear we can be in our communication, the better. Almost no one strongly disagreed with that statement. Right. And so I think that is key. And I think what's interesting is that the anxiety level, so the data were collected at 2 points in time. We had the first round was May 7th. The second round was just a few weeks later on May 26th. And during that time, some places opened up and then closed back down. Mm-hmm. And some places that thought they were going to get to open didn't actually get to open. And so the anxiety is higher on May 26th than it is on May 7th. And that's statistically significant. So it's not just a few points. Statistically, it's not an anomaly. And so I think that's really important, that the more certain we can be about things, the easier it is for us. So that's part of kind of what makes us human, is we need to know what to expect. We have to have somewhere to place things in our framework of understanding. And so that certainty that, okay, I know that for the next so many months, I'm going to be doing Zoom church and I don't like it, but I know, and I'm not looking forward to something and excited about it, and then it gets taken away.
Right.
So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful response to that. Randy, I'll turn to you. We'll start landing the plane here in a couple of minutes, but I'm just kind of curious, what are you seeing there you think you'd want to tease out?
Yeah, I rolled back through a lot of that, and obviously people are finding some resourcefulness in technology they didn't have before, and I'm more inclined to think that's a good thing than not. It's a good servant, it's a miserable master, and so you have to kind of. But there was also just a lot of ways in which they were getting small groups together outside the building. And so in some ways they're finding kind of decentered ways that don't revolve around the building to get people together. And in some cases, maybe people who wouldn't have been together otherwise outside. Sometimes it's by Zoom, sometimes it's in a small group, and depending on, what the level of contagion is in your area, you have to think about that. But to me, that's one of those things which in your church, if you develop those habits, you'd want to retain them after this is over. and find out that there's a lot of life that can run through your church that has nothing to do with the church building that you've discovered, and you don't want to just give that up. And I found that with myself, that I've grown closer to my covenant group, and we've met outside and where we could in very small groups and socially distanced ways, but that's become the lifeline, and it's become more precious to me than it was before. And now I see the value in it. And I think we were I think we have the right theology on this. None of us think the building is the church, but I think we were probably too building centric in the way we were building community, and we're sort of learning something about that.
That's good. Thank you for that summary. And yes, maybe we have to find ways to decenter and localize and contextualize in smaller ways. Well, we are coming close to the end of the hour. I'm going to ask both of you. I'll start with you, Suzie. Is there any last word or thought that, as you reflect about your research work, and I know you're planning to do more. We're talking about launching some new research here to kind of continue to probe what was a sprint that's now a marathon, right? But any last thought or observation as you reflect on our conversation today or the data you've been working with?
I think I want to give a word of encouragement that the majority of people are happy with how their church has responded, and feel that their leadership is doing a good job, or they did in May. Hopefully that's still the case. But I want to give that word of encouragement to keep trying to reach out and build community, and not be frustrated by lack of engagement in online services. Try to find other ways to engage that can reach those that aren't always there. We do know that those who were less likely to attend before the pandemic were the ones who were more anxious and less excited about going back to church. And so reaching out to those who maybe were on the fringes to begin with, because your core is probably going to remain. It's those that are on the fringes that you need to kind of be watching over.
That's good. Good. Randy, any last word?
No, I think I want to join in on that encouraging word. I mean, Carson and I talk to so many ministers and churches, and I think churches have really come through in a wonderful way. And it's not what any of us would have drawn up or wanted, but the church has not been nearly as flat-footed as I was afraid it might be. It's proved to be quite agile, and that's encouraging. God was doing very well through 2,000 years of very different, cultures and arrangements, and he can thrive in this too.
Yeah, we are indeed, I think, in being invited into a pilgrimage that takes us into new places, uncharted territory. And we're having to rely more and more on faith and hope and possibility and taking risks than simply being flat-footed. And in that time, I know as I just look through the names of folks who are in this conversation today and the ideas that are flowing through the chat, that it actually encourages me to see both those names and the ideas that are flowing. So thank you to you, those of you who are participating with us today, for joining us. I want to say thank you, Dr. Macaluso, for being with us. In fact, I think we're releasing today a new blog series from you that's coming out of some of this research. So a special note to everyone, look on the Mosaic's blog site for Suzie's reporting out of this material, and we're going to be looking for more research coming from Suzie and along with the Siburt Institute on following what's happening in churches in this time and this season. I want to thank Renee, our events coordinator, and the Siburt Institute staff for their work today. We've got another intersection slated in September 15. Please mark your calendar. Dr. Richard Beck will be with us that day. We'll start at a little different time. I think it's at 11:30 Central Time start, half past the hour rather than the top of the hour. We'll be sending out information about Richard and that September 15th intersection. That'll be intersection number 5.
Do you think Richard Beck might be interesting?
I don't know. We'll see if we can't goad him into something. We'll get something going on that. But until then, we want to encourage you all in your life and work and ministry. And Randy will ask you to send us off with a blessing here today.
Thanks for everybody to come. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy, to the only God our Savior be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.
Amen. God's peace.